It's my great pleasure to welcome all of you today to Connecting the Corridor and to connect you to the corridor. This is going to be our plenary. There's going to be 3 short introductory talks. I've been charged with discussing the history and the lessons to be learned from building the conserved lands network that we already have in Florida. Carlton is going to share his thoughts on storytelling and inspiring hearts and minds to connect to the Florida. And Mallory is going to present the strategic vision and connect all of you to the paths forward for the future of the corridor. I want to give a huge shout out to the people in this room who have built the conserved land base on which we are building the corridor. The state and federal and local agencies, the non-profits, all of the individuals that supported all of the conservation lands over the past decades. We owe all of you a great vote of thanks. I'm going to tell my story about the history of conserved lands in Florida in 10 lessons. The transitions, the pivot points, the turning points in that history. But before I start, it's always nice to reflect a little bit on what it is that is so special about Florida. You know, we were blessed with geography, temperate to tropics, 1,000 miles of coastline, 10,000 miles of beautiful rivers and streams, more than 7,000 lakes and springs. An extraordinary array of biodiversity, rare species found nowhere else on Earth. Florida is, a piece of stunning biological serendipity. That same confluence of land and water and sun has always attracted people here. It always has and it always will. So there is, and has been since the beginning, a tension between the development of Florida and protecting its natural resources. This home is the home of Harriet Beecher Stowe, authoress of Uncle Tom's Cabin, who lived in Mandarin, Florida, and wrote hundreds of articles and essays enticing people to come to Florida because of climate and because of our beautiful oranges. At the same time she was doing this, the early conservationists were writing books. John Kunkel Small, From Eden to Sahara, Raymond Dasman, No Further Retreat, a pushback on the effects of development over time. Leap forward to 1981, and this edition of Sports Illustrated, the swimsuit edition, of course, landed on the desk of Governor Graham. And Robert Boyle described the beauties of Florida's waters, and then in excruciating detail how they were being degraded and decimated. That galvanized Governor Graham into action. Who knew that Christie Brinkley would be one of the great inadvertent heroines of Florida conservation? We all know that growth has been exponential. I arrived in Florida in 1985, and we've doubled our population since then, and classic exponential growth. And every week, every month, there's articles in our newspapers. This from last year, from Kevin Spear, writing the Orlando Sentinel, about the eventual collapse of the Destiny real estate development, and its almost miraculous conversion into one of the great new conservation icons of Florida, the DeLuca Preserve. So there's tension over time. And that sets the stage for the next 10 lessons from our history of Florida conservation. Lesson number 1. And I'm going to start with a shout out to our scientists, all the scientists in the room and the scientists past and present, because science has always been ready to build the next stage, the next step for the conservation of Florida. We started off, Florida's a mecca for explorers and for naturalists. So from the 1770s onwards, William Bartram, John Muir, John Kunkel Small, Frank Chapman, the list goes on, echoing down through the generations until we get our modern explorers such as Carlton Ward, who's going to speak to you soon. Florida scientists were critical in building biodiversity knowledge. We were also one of the great science teams that built the understanding of game management, Herb Stoddard up in northwest Florida. Florida scientists were among the first to publish the importance of fire for the critical long-term maintenance of Florida. And our state's complex water resources attracted the nation's finest hydrologists to inform our conservation. we were the state that first instigated and really effectively managed tracking long-term progress in conservation lands. Florida is exceptional in knowing which lands have been acquired when, under which programs, with Florida Natural Areas Inventory. Yeah. A next step, which is very pertinent for this meeting, is that national leadership in science, particularly Larry Harris in the early 80s, and also Reed Noss and Tom Hockter, who are here with us at this meeting, really explained the importance of connectivity among conserved lands to achieve effective conservation. And this little thumbnail sketch map on the top shows their vision in the 80s of what a connected Florida would look like. You'll see that again. And we have always been at the forefront of endangered species work, and we've been at the forefront of working on payments for environmental services. So my second big theme is in Florida, we have had a long history of the public being outraged by conservation sort of impacts. You know, starting first of all with the devastating impact of the harvesting of wading birds in South Florida for hats for women's, for plumes for women's hats. And the despicable murder of Guy Bradley in 1903, the first game warden actually appointed to protect those same wading birds by Audubon. That outrage is a powerful force for conservation. When people feel threat and loss and plunder, and they feel it now, they feel they're losing Florida, that is a stimulus for conservation. My next theme is going to be that outrage often pushes tremendous public groundswells. The outrage over wading birds pushed the groundswell of the women's movements, establishing the first prototype state park, Royal Palm State Park, in the southeast of which eventually became the cornerstone of Everglades. Our groundswell, has led us to, eliminating the cross-Florida Barge Canal, restoring the Kissimmee River. These groundswells are critical. And in fact, really drove Florida to be a place where the national government invested in national icons of conservation value in Florida. And I'm going to give you a series of maps over the next slides, and I'm going to point out to them how these different contributions built the conservation network we have today. And this first one is the national icons in Florida of federally protected lands, a total of a percentage of Florida's conserved lands. Our next theme that I'm going to work on is the theme of the tremendous impact on the need to protect resources for wildlife, hunting, and fishing. Very early on, Florida was one of the first places. President Teddy Roosevelt established Pelican Island, the first national wildlife refuge in 1903 in Florida. Those who were interested in hunting and fishing both taxed themselves at a federal level, the Duck Stamp Program for licenses, Pittman-Robertson Act for funding equipment purchases for hunting and fishing. Those supported and funded the first game management areas in Florida, Corbett and Cecil Webb. So if we look at the overall impact of lands purchased for hunting and for fishing and for wildlife, that actually, the origins of those nowadays account for 19% of Florida's conservation lands, both national wildlife refuges or state wildlife management areas. Shout out to all of those stakeholders on their important implications for conservation continuing to this day. The next theme that's building the story is the story of the need to protect resources for the state or for national good. Clearly one of those was timber in the national interest. So in Florida, although most national forests were established early on out west, there were several established in Florida. This is some planting and plowing in Apalachicola National Forest. But there were 4 initially established in 1908 and in the 1930s. Some of you may wonder, what is that national park, Choctawhatchee? I've never heard of it. That was deeded to DOD and became the eventual Eglin Air Force Range. So, but 4 national parks. Where are we now with the interest for conservation for forest resources of a state or national importance? Those lands, between them, cumulatively account for 22% of Florida's conservation lands, an enormous contribution to building this sort of protected area network on which we will eventually build the corridor. My next theme is stimulus and match really do incentivize conservation. I'll start off with an old story. When FDR, President Roosevelt, was launching the New Deal, one of the programs that he established eventually became known as the Civilian Conservation Corps. It was predicated that as a state, you had to have state parks or state forests in order to get the money and the jobs. Florida responded with remarkable alacrity. Within 6 years, we had 9 state forests and 9 state parks and 3 state forests. That generated 50,000 jobs in the height of the Depression as a result of federal stimulus. In recent years, federal state match and local and federal match has contributed tremendously to building our parks network. Both at a state level, we have one of the most wonderful state park systems in the country, and at a local level, county parks and city parks, so that now that park complex contributes 11% to the network of conservation lands in Florida. And hold on to that thought, stimulus and matching funds work over time. My next theme, where the pieces came together from the pieces of the puzzle, really dates back to World War II. That same geography that favored the development of Florida's biodiversity also favored training for the national defense during World War II. We had many airfields established, Army airfields and naval stations, bombing ranges, Eglin and Air Force Base, several others, Camp Blanding, Camp Johnson. Some were sunsetted and returned to owners after World War II, Camp Johnson being one of them, but a lot of them were retained and are now part of a really important contribution towards our conservation network. And shout out to DoD, an organization that recognized that achieving its military mission was compatible with achieving a mission for conservation. We owe 7% of our conservation network to lands that are either meeting National Guard or DoD national security needs. And that is expanding in that both the big Air Force ranges, the bombing ranges, Eglin and Avon Park, now recognize that they would like to team up with conservation organizations and with state and federal agencies to protect encroachment around those sites. These are known as the sentinel landscapes, where securing the national interest also means securing the lands around those DoD sites over time. Our next theme coming together is the theme of water. Water is, of course, paramount in Florida. I don't need to tell this audience this. But the sort of degradation of water resources, and this is the Great Kissimmee River in 1919, pre-dredging, pre-channelization. But the degradation of Florida's water systems stimulated Governor Kirk in the 70s plus the legislature to establish the 5 water management districts and begin to put in funding for water management. There is no other state that has wall-to-wall mechanisms for protecting water and for conserving land. And our water management districts in Florida protect 18% of our conservation protected area network, an extraordinary contribution. Shout out to all of those who helped build that, who helped restore those lands, all of the water managers, the state agencies, the local agencies that contributed to this effort, and federal agencies. My last point to make is that private lands, my 9th point to make is that private lands have always contributed to conservation in Florida. They've always contributed in the sense that the low-intensity private lands, typically timber and ranching, have been a real harbor for wildlife in Florida. And we also have a lot of conservation organizations, field stations like where I work at Archbold, non-profits like land trusts who own and manage conservation lands in Florida as part of the network, and increasingly mitigation banks. So what I wanted to sort of point out is that private lands managed, dedicated for conservation, is another 0.35 million acre chunk of the nearly 10 million acres conserved network we have in Florida. It's important to reflect a little bit on the programs that funded these extraordinary achievements, and are there lessons to be learned from these? I'm sorry about the font size, so bear with me and I'll talk you through it. I'm going back to 1960, and I'm only focusing on state programs with the recognition that so much can also be learned from federal and from local programs as well, but I'll focus here on state programs. Early on, the early programs, the programs, the Land Acquisition Trust Fund, the Environmentally Endangered Lands Program, or EO, the Conservation and Recreation Lands Program, or COL, there were some key lessons we learned from those programs, and it's important to reflect on them. First of all, taxes are not popular for funding conservation. You know, they started out with a bathing suits tax, universally despised as a conservation mechanism. Moved on to minerals, phosphate, oil, and gas, not popular for supporting conservation. What worked then, what has worked since then, and what works now is bonding for conservation. It's provided a lot of security and confidence in conservation funding. We then move on to Governor Graham's program, Save Our Rivers, Save Our Coasts, and we move on to Preservation 2000, the flagship program initiated by the legislature and under Governor Bob Martinez, who had asked a commission on the environmental future of Florida, you know, what do we need to do about protecting Florida's resources? And the answer was very simple. There's more land to buy than money to buy it. And that is what propelled P2000, a $3 billion acquisition program over 10 years, into one of the most astoundingly successful conservation programs in Florida. And that same theme is recurring in the establishment of Florida Forever, with strong voter support and legislative response to that. And that same more land to buy than money to buy it continues through today, you know, supporting those programs. I have to apologize, I didn't have time to add onto my graph the Rural and Family Lands Protection Program. I'm very aware of it, and sorry for that. I really wanted to give it a little shout out here, and I'll get the numbers for the next version of this graph. This is not a timeline, but it shows you the cumulative acreage over time, what was achieved over time. And the colors on the graph correspond to the colors in the programs below. So pink is in EEL program, yellow is P2000. And I wanted to make a couple of points. The $1 million that went towards, this is cumulative acreage. So as you go across the graph, the cumulative acreage gets close to 4 million acres under this state period over time. There's one other point I want to make on this graph. At the end of the EEL program, there was a profound lesson for conservation in Florida. The program devolved because of kickbacks at the highest state level. We lost some key acquisition sites at the end of the EEL program. But what it did is it set the stage for CARL and for all programs thereafter. It set the stage for the need for governance, for strong procedures, for accountability, and for confidence. And it is that public confidence in the transparency of this process. It is tedious and tough to do this, but it is that confidence that has sustained conservation programs from that point onwards. And we should never forget that public accountability and public confidence has been a huge underpinning of successful conservation in Florida. I'll also point out the astoundingly successful P2000 program. If you're looking at the little boxes, that's the price per acre that was paid during those conservation programs. Clearly, the 73 miles of coastline cost more than the 73,000 acres of Save Our Rivers. Beaches are more expensive than wetlands. But you can see P2000, extraordinarily successful. The early years of Florida Forever, and now we recognize we're facing the headwinds of after the Great Recession and increasing land values. But there are important lessons to learn from what made success under these programs. So in conclusion, I'd like to take a little three-step flashback over since 1995. And this is my time to thank again every single person present and past, who contributed towards building these next three graphs. This is the conservation lands that were protected by 1995. There are some local and private lands that are missing from this graph. It's hard to get down all the data. This is where we were in 2008. Tremendous progress in that intervening time period. And this is where we are in 2021. I wanted to sort of really stress that during this time, we should be appalled at what we lost in Florida and absolutely amazed at what we managed to save. And this has set the background, set the stage for how we can envisage a connected landscape, a connected Florida for a Florida wildlife corridor. So I'll leave with a little thought that it's self-evident when you look at a map like this. It's self-evident in Florida conservation that the good that we can do together surpasses the good that we can do alone. So on that note, I'll thank you very much, and I'm about to hand over to the next speaker, who will be Carlton Ward.
Thank you, Hillary, and thank you all for being here today. It's really humbling and an honor to be gathered with so many conservation heroes and to give a presentation after one and before another. My name's Carlton Ward Jr., and I'm a conservation photographer. I'm going to be talking to you for the next 15 or 20 minutes about building the story of the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And it's a story that is interwoven with so many of you here. I'm going to start out with a little bit of a personal journey and mention that the picture on this screen is from the longleaf pine forest of the Florida Panhandle. This is the largest intact swath of that ecosystem left on the planet, and a place of great inspiration. But my journey as a conservation photographer started a little further from home. I had a chance to work in the Central African rainforest of Gabon during and after graduate school, and it's a place where I learned about the value of connected, intact wilderness. That country is 80% forest covered still today. It's also a place where I learned about the power of combining storytelling with science as an agent for conservation. The person in this picture is Mike Fay. He's a scientist of the Wildlife Conservation Society and a National Geographic explorer. And when I was in Gabon, they had just finished a 1,200-mile expedition from the center of the Congo to the Atlantic coast of Gabon. And the 3-part series in National Geographic magazine and their collective outreach inspired the creation of 13 new national parks in that country. So this really left an impression on me of what can be possible. I stayed distracted in Africa for a little bit longer. I had a chance to work with a migratory herd of desert elephants in Mali, which was really inspiring in the way that these animals traveled 500 miles 500 miles every single year through 2 different countries in Mali and Burkina Faso, and showed the importance of connecting lands for wide-ranging wildlife. But during this time when I was leaving Florida and going away to Africa for 1 or 2 or 3 months at a time, every time I came home, the ranchlands of my youth were visibly changing and looking more like this. Because then, in the early 2000s, as now, we were losing nearly 100,000 acres of rural and natural lands to development every single year. And while you could learn all about Africa on television, and people knew more about that than home, I felt like there was not enough storytelling focused on this sort of loss in our home state. So then, in 2005, began a focus on the nature and culture of Florida's ranchlands. And the motivation for that is these ranches at the time comprised 1/5 of the state of Florida by landmass, but were virtually missing from Florida's identity. In one way or another, I've been focused on ranches for nearly 20 years now. Back in 2006, I was working on the 2nd annual calendar with the Florida Cattlemen's Association, and it gave me a chance to visit this place, Buck Island Ranch, which happens to be owned and managed by Archibald Biological Station. And when I was there, Hillary Swain said to me, "There's somebody I want you to meet." And it wasn't this black bear, at least not directly. She introduced me to Joe Guthrie, who, like me, was a master's student, and he was studying the black bears that were living on these South Central Florida ranches in Highlands County. And Joe and his colleagues from the University of Kentucky were using GPS tracking collars to follow the movements of bears across their habitat, which was predominantly working lands. So in this moment, I began to see the Florida black bear, like the Florida rancher, as an emblem for Florida's wild and hidden heart. 2006 was a big year, at least in my mind, for shaping the Florida Wildlife Corridor story. Many of you remember the Florida 2060 study that was produced by the Florida Department of Agriculture, 1,000 Friends of Florida, and the University of Florida. And what this was doing was projecting forward Florida's population growth on its current trajectory. At the time, 2006, Florida had 16 million people. This map, the green areas depict the nearly 10 million acres of conservation lands. The red shows the development footprint. So pay attention to that red as time goes on. You can see the consequences for our green spaces. Areas like Ocala National Forest and the Green Swamp in the Northern Peninsula get surrounded on all sides by development. And the 4 million acres of public land in the Everglades could get cut off from the rest of the state and the country. But it doesn't have to be that way. As Hillary showed us, scientists have been advocating for decades for a connected network of conservation land. This is that map from Reed Noss at the University of Central Florida. But this concept had been slower to take hold within the public circles. The absence of wildlife corridors in public conversation became even more clear that same year when there was a proposal for a new toll road called the Heartland Parkway. This road was proposed to go from Orlando all the way down to Naples and could cut right through the ranch lands where Joe was studying those bears near Archibald Biological Station. And in the articles written about these roads, including a great article by Cynthia Barnett in Florida Trend, there was discussion of all kinds of corridors: transportation corridors, multimodal transportation corridors, rural and economic development corridors, hurricane evacuation corridors, but there was no mention of wildlife corridors. So that's when I went to the internet and started searching around for things like Florida Wildlife Corridor, and surprisingly, not much was there on that topic. So we reserved a few domain names thinking they might be useful someday. Then Governor Charlie Crist vetoed this road proposal, but there was a sense that something like it might come back, and we wanted to be ready. So I had an opportunity to continue photographing bears and ranches and learning more from Joe and his team about the way these animals were moving across and utilizing the landscape. There was one particular bear that they collared in 2009 called M34. And this bear, in 2 months in the summer of 2010, walked for 500 miles, more than 100 miles from north to south, connecting from Babcock Ranch in southwest Florida to the edge of Orlando. And there's going to be a great story map by Angeline Meeks from Archibald that's going to go more into bringing this story to life that you'll be able to check out tomorrow. But I want to show you some of the things that we learned from it. The reason that that bear was able to walk so far in between a scattered network of protected lands is the scope of working lands, the cattle ranches, the orange groves, the working forest. These pieces were holding that patchwork of land together. One of the early advocates of the importance of working lands for wide-ranging animals, especially bears and panthers, was David Mayer. He was Joe's major professor at the University of Kentucky and a former panther expert. He died tragically in a plane crash in 2008 with rancher Mason Smoke as they were tracking a black bear in Highlands County. And that next year, Joe and his colleagues and other students organized a bear workshop at Archibald Biological Station. So in December of 2009, people were coming together to talk about the implications of this research. I was fortunate to be able to attend, and during that talk, Tom Hochter, who's the architect of the Florida Ecological Greenways Network, was giving a presentation about landscape linkages in Florida, including a lot of these critical linkages. The Ocala to Osceola Corridor, the Fish Eating Creek to Ocala Ecological Greenway, option 1 and 2, the Caloosahatchee Connector, And as a somewhat naive journalist in the room, I raised my hand and said, Tom, is there any way we can string these together and call it something like Florida Wildlife Corridor so people will have a better sense of what we're talking about? And I had no idea what we were getting into. But I had some great meetings with Tom, and we soon after were meeting with Richard Hilsenbeck from the Nature Conservancy and a steering group that represents many of the organizations here today. In early 2010, we settled on the name Florida Wildlife Corridor and commissioned this painting to depict the primary trunk of the corridor that could connect from the Everglades to Georgia. So to try to bring more attention to this idea, and remembering the success of that mega transect expedition across Africa and inspired by the movements of that black bear M34, we put together a pair of public awareness expeditions, 1,000 miles each. One was in 2012 and the other in 2015. The expeditioning team included the fearless leader of the Florida Wildlife Corridor Coalition, Mallory Dimmitt, myself, and Joe Guthrie. We began that first 100-day expedition south in the Everglades because arguably the Everglades ecosystem has the most at stake in this proposition of whether or not we protect a wildlife corridor as a lifeline to the north. These were phenomenal experiences, and we learned so many things. Like, for example, the scale of the Everglades watershed. We hiked and paddled for 51 days on that first expedition before we ever set foot out of the Everglades watershed, stepping over into the St. Johns and continuing our journey further north. The final leg of that first expedition followed the Suwannee River upstream into the Okefenokee Swamp and into southern Georgia. The 2015 expedition began at the midway point of that first expedition. This is the Nature Conservancy's Disney Wilderness Preserve. It's a gateway to the Everglades headwaters, which is this western scale conservation opportunity hidden here in the east. And we traversed west around the Gulf Coast to places like Chassahowitzka National Wildlife Refuge and into that expedition in the longleaf pine forest of the Western Panhandle. These expeditions helped us build relationships with many of you and your organizations around the conservation goals we share. They strengthened our alignment with stakeholders and landowners whose properties we had to get permission to cross, and we began to start raising public awareness. We published books and dozens of news articles and partnered with filmmakers to make PBS documentaries, including working with Eric Bendick from Grizzly Creek Films, who is here today. Since 2015, the Corridor Foundation has produced 3 shorter, more focused expeditions looking at critical linkages and bottlenecks within the corridor. One example was the expedition in 2018 that went from the Everglades headwaters across I-4 to the Green Swamp and was the basis for the film The Last Green Thread. We did another expedition in 2019 connecting from ranch to ridge and was the basis for the film The Wild Divide. And then there's the exciting Springs to Shore expedition, which Mallory will tell you more about from 2021. During this time, I was looking for new ways to help elevate the Florida Wildlife Corridor story. And I went to my editor at National Geographic magazine wanting to do a story about the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And she basically said no. But then she told me that they might be interested in doing a story about the Florida panther, and we could tell the story of the corridor through that. So that 15-minute conversation sent me onto kind of a 6-year-long obsession. And we'll get to that. But that same year, I also got an assignment from National Geographic Travel, and I had to photograph 10 different parks in South Florida, one of which was Florida Panther National Wildlife Refuge. So we set up camera traps and tried for 2 months for a one-day assignment, and this is the picture we got. It's a female panther walking away from the camera, kind of daring us to follow her. And I took the bait because I was connecting with scientists and conservationists in South Florida, and having done these expeditions, was beginning to see the panther as the ultimate emblem of the Florida Wildlife Corridor that could help us raise the story to the next level of impact. So motivated to tell this panther story, we started the Path of the Panther project with some additional grants from the National Geographic Society. There's a feature-length documentary about that just premiered at the Florida Film Festival on Saturday, and will hopefully be available to the public within the year. From that, I'm just going to share a few highlights from what I've learned from the panther story. Starting with this. This is the big news for the Florida panther. And I see Jen Korn, a biologist here in the audience. She and Brian Kelly, a colleague of the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, got this photograph in November of 2016. This is the first female panther documented north of the Caloosahatchee River since 1973. That's a big deal. And it's because this river, a dividing line from Lake Okeechobee to Charlotte Harbor, had been the northern barrier to female panther expansion, practically for my entire lifetime. Male panthers have been wandering the peninsula for decades. There's one shot by a hunter 11 years ago on latitude with Atlanta. But those males up north before this time would never find a female. So this was that really pivotal moment where the panther was having a chance to reclaim its historic territory. When I got that news, they let me set up some camera traps nearby, and I also reached out to another Florida conservation hero, Kerry Lightsey, to ask him what he thought about this panther in the northern Everglades, where he has most of his cattle ranches. I'll never forget what he said to me. He said, "Carlton, the panther is going to have to help us save Florida, because it's going to help the world understand why we need to save these large areas." Kerry's words became the mantra for our work at the Path of the Panther Project, and we kept working with our camera traps, especially focused at Babcock Ranch. After 14 months of trying there, we got this picture. And this is a cat that Jen Korn named Babs, and there she was looking into the camera, being followed by 2 Florida panther kittens, of the first generations to be born in the northern Everglades in my lifetime. This was the most important photo of my career in this huge beam of hope. But at the same time, shortly after, a new threat was emerging because the MCOR's toll roads were proposed. And just like in 2006, the southern toll road was proposed to go from Orlando to Naples, this time right by the territory of this panther, Babs. But there was a big difference from 2006. Thanks to many of you in this room and the advocacy of the Corridor Foundation and others, the Florida Wildlife Corridor was a very big part of the conversation in those public hearings. And thankfully, we had the story of the Florida panther to help us elevate this issue in national media. The planning for the new toll roads in MCORs in 2019 and 2020 really put a lot of pressure on our efforts. We realized for the Florida Wildlife Corridor to survive, it needed to be recognized in law. So starting in 2019, the Path of the Panther Project launched an impact campaign with the National Geographic Society and the Florida Wildlife Corridor Foundation. We worked with the Department of Environmental Protection and with University of Florida and Florida Natural Areas Inventory to get the Florida Ecological Greenways Network updated in anticipation of potential legislation that could follow. In building towards the 2021 legislative session, we produced a suite of strategic communications, including National Geographic branded brochures and maps, and a short film titled Saving the Florida Wildlife Corridor, produced by the National Geographic Impact Media Lab. And Vanessa Soreo, who leads that team, is going to be with us and leading a session in the storytelling program tomorrow. The film is also playing at the 5 p.m. screening in the screening room today. Also, in April of 2021, the full feature story on the Florida panther was published in National Geographic magazine, at the same time that the Florida Wildlife Corridor legislation was being considered. And a copy of each of these magazine excerpts has been provided for you today. During that legislative session, we distributed these magazines to all of our lawmakers and colleagues, and we were able to share special screenings of the film Saving the Florida Wildlife Corridor. Mallory is going to tell you more about the legislation and its success and implications. But I would like to just say I'm thankful that our leaders in Florida shared our enthusiasm for this moment and this opportunity we're in to work together to save wild Florida. So I'd like to end my portion of the talk by thanking each of you for everything that you have done to help shape this story. whether it's been trusting us with your science, whether it's been hosting us on your properties, whether it's been doing your work that you're doing to save the land, or whether it's been using your own voices to build the Florida Wildlife Corridor story. Thanks to all of our collective work, the Florida Wildlife Corridor has grown from an idea to a geography that now officially belongs to all Floridians. And for the storytellers among us, whether it's established or aspiring, I hope you will please participate in the media and education track tomorrow, because together we can find new ways to elevate the story of the Florida Wildlife Corridor and continue to inspire its protection. With that, I welcome to the stage the CEO of the Florida Wildlife Corridor Foundation, Mallory Dimmitt, who will take us through the vision of what we can do next together.
Thank you. Thanks, Carlton. And on the way up here, I got a text that said, we need you to go faster, and Carlton has gone long, and I just got a flashback to all 5 expeditions that we've ever done together. So all joking aside, I want to thank you, Hillary and Carlton, for providing that important history and context so beautifully. My name is Mallory Dimmitt, and I'd like to take this chance to also welcome you to the Florida Wildlife Corridor Summit. And I'm going to cover over the next period, which hopefully when we look back at the end of this decade will be the most active and successful chapter in the corridor's history. I'm so very thrilled that all of you are here at this first ever multi-day Florida Wildlife Corridor Summit to get it started. And wow, looking out at this crowd is impressive. The level of interest to participate in this sold-out summit demonstrates the momentum that's building. And this gathering is a great way to capture the energy and funnel it toward action for achieving collective goals. This is your corridor. I could not be more excited to be with you here to celebrate all that's been accomplished and so far and all that we will do next, working together to ensure its future. So I joined the Florida Wildlife Corridor Foundation as CEO in August. We have a new name and a new logo, but our mission remains unchanged. I've been involved in the corridor since its inception and have participated in each of the expeditions that you just heard about. This photo is one of my favorites from that very first expedition, taken by Carlton 10 years ago this month as we paddled upstream on the Swanee River to the Okefenokee Swamp. And when I rejoined the organization last year, I felt like the timing was fantastic because after years of tireless work from so many of you in this room, and supported by the decades of work that came before that Hillary described, it felt like we were finally and even surprisingly suddenly picking up speed and going with the current and with the wind at our back. And that's because the passage of the Florida Wildlife Corridor Act last spring signaled via unanimous vote strong bipartisan support for not just the idea of connected conservation, but also the critical funding to get it done. And in July, the Florida Wildlife Corridor Act became law, and the governor held a ceremonial signing at Disney Wilderness Preserve not too far from here. This act takes a first key step toward recognizing a connected corridor across all of Florida and encourages its conservation. It's forward-thinking to sustain the green infrastructure that is the backbone of Florida's economy and quality of life. The Florida Wildlife Corridor is recognized by the act, or your corridor, encompasses nearly 18 million acres in total, 10 million of which in the dark green color have already been protected, and the 8 million shown in lighter green that do not yet have conservation status and which we classify as opportunity areas. So the law seeks to secure habitats for wide-ranging wildlife, to prevent fragmentation of critical lands, to protect the headwaters of major watersheds, to help sustain working farms, ranches, and forests, and to preserve lands and waters to protect coastal estuaries for generations to come. Our legislature also directed $300 million to protect the Florida Wildlife Corridor opportunity areas, bringing total land protection last year to $400 million, or 4 times the previous year's allocation. I'd like to take a moment here to thank the leadership, the bill sponsors, Senator Broder and Representative Trunow, who's with us here, and all the legislators. Thank you. And I'll add to that my thanks to all the legislators who are here or will be with us here at the summit, and to all of your colleagues for your support of the Act and this remarkable legacy for Florida. And I'm also pleased to report that Speaker-designate Renner will be joining us to share a few words during tomorrow morning's plenary session. So, following the passage of this act, Florida is poised to set a global example for how nature, rare and endangered wildlife, and a robust, growing economy can thrive together. What we do next for the opportunity areas will be critical in how this program succeeds and in the example that we set for others. As monumental as the law's passage was, there were other achievements in 2021 that I would also like to highlight. The Spring to Shore expedition was planned and completed to highlight an important yet unprotected bottleneck in the corridor. This narrow stretch of opportunity area is critical to linking almost 2 million acres between the Big Bend and the Nature Coast. Narrow, fragile connections like this exist in more than 100 places throughout your corridor, where they represent the best and often the only remaining threads holding our treasured conservation lands together. This expedition was extra special because for the first time in our history of expeditions, we focused on young explorers. 3 teen girls from the local Nature Coast region literally immersed themselves into learning about the vital land-water conservation connection. This trek covered 50 miles on a 4-day journey, starting in the Rainbow Springs State Park and ending with a marine debris cleanup in Homosassa Bay. And Carlton, Joe, and I, the original trekkers, got to join them for part of that expedition and had such a great time with Ava, Mallory, and Marin, the 3 teenage trekkers. We loved paddling with them down the last miles of the Withlacoochee River to the Gulf, and it is so heartening to see the next generation excited about getting out into wild Florida. The film about that trek, titled Home Waters, comes out in the next few weeks, and my hope is that it will inspire their peers and young people everywhere to get out and wildly explore the corridor or their own backyards, and preferably with these girls' level of infectious enthusiasm. Other conservation successes in 2021 include an update to the Florida Ecological Greenways Network, the FEGN, and the boundaries of the Florida Wildlife Corridor, which are now defined by FEGN priorities 1 through 3. A new watercolor map by Mike Reagan was commissioned depicting these revisions, and these elements are key to corridor storytelling to help highlight the conservation wins to the public and decision makers as we're turning opportunity area pieces of the puzzle into conserved lands. For example, at the September cabinet meeting, nearly 20,000 acres were approved for conservation of your corridor in 6 projects. Each of these represents years of legwork and a winning combination of landowners, advisors, conservation partners, and funders whose success we all want to celebrate. The projects range from the Coastal Headwaters Longleaf Forest Project in Northwest Florida to Devil's Garden in the southwest corner of the state. All told, you all here in the greater conservation community protected 35,000 acres within the Florida Wildlife Corridor last year, or nearly 55 square miles spread across the state from the Panhandle to the Everglades. I don't have a map of all of your land protection projects shown in your corridor yet, but that's coming. And similarly, in development is a dashboard, a readout to roll up and display easement and acquisition progress across the state and in the corridor opportunity area in closer to real time. We're working with the Florida Natural Areas Inventory and Archbold to develop this tool, so stay tuned for more to come on that, as well as the potential for a conservation real estate database we're discussing with Conservation Florida in collaboration with the land trust community. And at the same time, I'm happy to report that 2022 is off to a very strong start for your corridor. Several of the acquisitions approved in September closed early this year, and the legislature approved another $400+ million in land conservation funding. And then 2 weeks ago, today, 10 projects were approved by the cabinet, including 7 parcels totaling over 16,000 acres within the Florida Wildlife Corridor. And so thanks to all the organizations, landowners, agencies, and programs involved, these properties are now certain to endure and to continue providing multi-layered benefits, such as preserving ancient scrub, archaeological and prehistoric sites, and protecting habitat for endangered and at-risk species. These are the vital connections needed for your corridor to preserve the ecosystems necessary to maintain our state's unique biodiversity. The lands protected, to be protected range from the Red Hills region near the Georgia border to the Kissimmee Prairie in the Everglades headwaters. It's so exciting to see the momentum and the enthusiasm for protecting Florida's diverse flora and fauna, and that many forces are coming together to support the effort. The framework of the Florida Wildlife Corridor has really re-energized land conservation in the Sunshine State, which benefits not just the corridor, but the entire state. So conserving lands anywhere, not just the corridor opportunity area, is a win for Floridians as well as the plants and animals that live here. But it's the corridor vision, all 18 million connected acres, that really positions Florida as a national leader. So let's see if that works. There we go. This map shows that we are leading the way, along with 7 other states shown here in dark purple, for a national movement for wildlife corridors and to achieve landmark conservation gains by 2030. This is our moment. As I said at the beginning of my remarks, I believe that this decade will determine the long-term success of your corridor. That's due to a combination of the momentum, as I've been describing, and also the urgency of the need for action. And as everyone statewide can attest, Florida is growing rapidly. Nearly 300,000 people moved to Florida last year, which is more than the population of the city of Orlando. And it used to be that people moved here for the weather of the Sunshine State, but now they're coming because of our strong economy and the increasing opportunities here. There are so many exciting and positive things happening in Florida, but we know that that growth also has led to a lot of sprawl and the loss of natural areas. With about 1,000 people continuing to move to Florida every day, new development can also lead to further habitat fragmentation of the corridor opportunity area. There's a ripple effect of that development that affects our air and water quality, wildlife, and ultimately our high quality of life, or the very thing that drew people to Florida in the first place. So we want to conserve the remaining wild places that make Florida, Florida, and also protect the incredible and tremendous investment, as Hillary detailed, in our existing conservation lands so that they can function as intended. That's why we need to act now, to usher in an age of smarter growth that benefits our environment and our economy. For too long, it's been presented as an either-or choice, but I think all of us in this room know that that's a false binary. And we're also gathering the data to prove that. The Florida Wildlife Corridor Foundation recently commissioned an economic study showing that the corridor not only provides inherent scientific, recreational, health, cultural, and spiritual values, but it's an important repository of economic value. And I want to thank everyone who attended the readout earlier this morning to get more information. I'm just going to hit 3 highlights from that study. The corridor supports at least 114,000 jobs and provides $30 billion in annual value across many sectors, including recreation, tourism, agriculture, and including ecosystem services. And between now and 2030, the study estimates that the corridor will protect nearly $300 billion in value to the state. And it also shows us that there's a 6x return on protecting that investment by protecting the Florida Wildlife Corridor. So failing to protect our land then has economic and environmental costs. Polluted waterways mean fewer tourism dollars flowing to Florida, and devastating impacts to the fishing and guiding industry. And that's just one of many examples. As Carrie Lightsey puts it, no one visits Florida to see a strip mall or a housing development. That same economic study underlined the importance of acting now to protect the unconserved land in the corridor. It found that without intervention, 900,000 acres could be developed by 2030. And by 2050, that number jumps to nearly 4 million acres, or half of the remaining corridor opportunity area. So if we don't protect those places in the corridor first, the ones that are at risk of development and conversion, we could collectively spend a lot of time, effort, and resources and not succeed at saving a connected corridor. That's an unacceptable outcome for me. So I'd like to posit that we stand here today with an opportunity to make a real and a lasting difference. We have the support of our civic leaders, We have the business community and our friends and neighbors all behind us. We have strong funding and awesome partners in all of you. With all of that, we as a community are ready to strategize and organize collectively to usher in the next era of conservation, and success depends on each of your help. The economic study recommended that we embrace a range of additional conservation techniques, such as nature-based tourism, carbon credits, and other market mechanisms. And given that the area within your corridor is large and diverse in ecology, human activities, parcel size, and economic opportunity, protecting it requires a variety of tools in addition to continuing and accelerating the traditional approaches through acquisitions and easements. So to incentivize additional funding approaches, I'm beyond thrilled to announce today that the Florida Wildlife Corridor Foundation will award up to $2 million in grants to advance conservation in the corridor opportunity areas. This is a new program. We're just rolling it out, and we're looking for novel outside-the-box approaches, new ways to leverage private capital for land protection or to establish new natural capital markets, and hopefully a range of solutions we haven't thought of yet. So we'll be opening the grant round in the next few weeks, and you can find more information on the Corridor Foundation's website. We encourage everyone here to help tackle this problem from different angles, exploring and maybe combining these non-traditional approaches and continuing to innovate on them over time could be the best way to ensure that as much of the land as possible in your corridor remains undeveloped to enjoy and appreciate for hundreds of years. So to succeed, we want your best ideas. Everyone here today can be part of the solution. We need your creativity and your expertise to find areas where our missions intersect and to co-create next generation solutions. As I said earlier, the next 8.5 years between now and 2030 represent the best opportunity that we've had in my lifetime, and likely longer, to accelerate the speed of conservation in order to fully establish your corridor as a protected area for generations to come. What we start here together today, tomorrow, and Thursday will set the course for growing coordination and collaboration among all the entities or industries that you all represent, and help to reach those who are not yet represented at the summit. So if by now you haven't realized, the theme for this inaugural summit is your corridor, and the organizers and the planners for each of the sessions are wanting your insights and your dialogue, and also your feedback on what we can do to improve upon our conservation activities and this summit for next year as we grow this gathering into something that you all look forward to annually. You heard Hillary invite your participation in the Frontiers of Science track on Wednesday, and then Carlton talked up the Passion and Purpose track on inspiration and storytelling. And I'm going to give a plug for the 2 other Corridor Academy tracks tomorrow, Funding Conservation at Scale and Scaling Solutions to Conservation, which we're going to combine for part of the day, so we'll be all together. And you definitely do not want to miss the campaign celebration concert tomorrow night, which is going to be a lot of fun. If you want to wear your dancing shoes for the rest of the summit, I'm cool with that. So. To sum up, I know that together we can and will be successful in achieving conservation at this awe-inspiring scale. I'm so excited that we're all here to usher in the next era of conservation for your corridor. It's the most important investment we can make for future generations, and I hope you'll join me in stepping up for our land, our water, and our Florida. Thank you.